Okay, I think we can start.
Great. All right, so welcome everyone from wherever in the world you happen to be joining us at whatever in the world time it might be for you. My name is Deborah Elms. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel. We are going to be talking about a really fascinating book today, a book that, to be honest, I thought was going to be a little not very interesting when I started, even though it has an all-star cast. And even though I know that most of the folks who have written chapters in this particular book are actually at the top of their game and quite excellent, somehow I thought the title was sort of, or maybe not the title, but the theme of the book was sort of, but actually it turned out to be riveting. I mean, honestly, very, very riveting. So what they've done in this book, and Bernard and Professor Tu will talk about it in just a second, is they have paired up two different views of WTO in particular and trade in general, which is someone from Europe and someone from China to give differing perspectives, often surprisingly similar perspectives on all kinds of different issues. And so I'm delighted to be here today to help get us through this panel. I know we're going to start with a slideshow first to just describe to you what the book is. It's available now as an ebook, so please do download and read it. Apparently, it's also going to be published, which I think is great. It's, again, I cannot highly recommend this book enough to you. I think it is quite interesting and unique because it brings together perspectives that we don't often see paired. And so I think that's fantastic. So you might not be surprised that Bernard and Professor Tu are part of the driving force behind this book. Both of them are first going to start by describing the book in a little bit more detail, take us through a slideshow of what's included. And then we'll have a short panel between the four of us. And please do bring questions to the table using the chat function on your Zoom link. So thank you all very much for coming. Let me turn it over now to Bernard to go through the slideshow that accompanies this book so that you have some sense of what I'm talking about when I say that this is a really interesting project. So over to you.
Great, thanks a lot for that introduction, Deborah, and thanks to everyone who's joining us in this particular session. I realize there is a huge amount of competition. I think there are very many interesting panels going on at the same time. So therefore, I think a lot of us will be going back to recordings of other sessions to actually figure out what was being said by everyone. So the genesis of this book we're going to speak to is a project that Professor Tu and I were involved in as part of a consortium under the Horizon 2020 framework research funding program. And that project really focused on external cooperation and trade from the perspective of the European Union. What should the EU be thinking about doing to do a better job really in realizing its external trade and foreign policy objectives. And clearly multilateral cooperation is one such instrument, and clearly the WTO is a big part of that set of instruments we have for multilateral cooperation. So that's essentially the background to how we got to actually get people to ask, to write chapters on where are China and the European Union, at least in terms of people who've been thinking about international cooperation, trade cooperation, both bilaterally, but also in terms of how does that translate at the multilateral level? Where are we kind of on the same page, right? So here we're not talking about official policy, whether it's European Union or China, we're really talking about researchers, academics, to what extent do they agree on what the key issues are and the path forward. So let me just share my screen now. So as was already mentioned by Deborah, the book is available on the Vox EU site. So just search for either our names or for WTO, it'll pop up. The background to the book is well known to everybody on this call. And essentially what we've asked authors to do is to think about where is there scope for the European Union and China to agree, in a sense that they have similar type of objectives, similar types of preferences on concrete issues. And some of those issues have to do with how the WTO works. So it's more of a WTO reform agenda, but a lot of it has to do with substantive negotiating topics. right? So both the EU and China have made clear they are strong supporters of multilateral cooperation. And the question we're kind of asking and that the authors are exploring is, where can they cooperate to revitalize the WTO as a forum for agreeing on expanding the rule book, filling gaps in that rule book, and settling disputes, as opposed to going a unilateral route? So we're not going to go through everything in the book. We're just going to give you a brief flavor. There's 13 chapters, and the only thing I want to emphasize here is that the focus is on what everybody collectively kind of agreed were important cross-cutting institutional questions, and what were important kind of policy areas where there are significant international competitive spillovers that need to be addressed. So that means that some of the things that are being discussed at the public forum today and that are really front and center in the run-up to MC12 are really not the focus of this book, right? So there isn't a lot of discussion about fish subsidies. There isn't a lot of discussion about public health, COVID, what do we do with vaccines? These are immediate here and now issues, and the sense was we should focus more on the longer term structural type of questions. So Hoekman, Professor Tu is going to go ahead and talk about some of the cross-cutting issues, and then I'll talk about some of the negotiating questions. But the premises of all of the chapters is that there's really 5 priorities for the system. One is to clarify the governance framework for open plurilateral agreements, right? The type of joint statement initiatives that are ongoing, but thinking more broadly, what is the scope for this down the road? Improving transparency, which is a common theme that comes out of many of the chapters. Resolving the dispute settlement crisis. Clearly, it makes no sense to negotiate if you can't enforce whatever has been negotiated. Differentiating between kind of development, economic development, and special and differential treatment, which is, we would argue, a key factor in moving forward. And another and final premise is that we're not going to get anywhere if we don't address a number of the old issues, old in quotes, which have been on the table for a long time and which have long been stuck. And agriculture is a good example of that, but we would argue subsidies is also an old issue, which is becoming increasingly important. So let me now turn it over to Hoekman. You're still muted, Hoekman.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard, for your introduction. As Deborah said, actually, this is a very fresh try, a fresh experiment between Europe and China. Of course, this is mainly from academic perspective, but it's a very new try for us. But the basic conclusion, I think, or my impression, basic impression is that I think we have more shared or common thoughts on these issues, at least between the scholars from the two sides. So we can see these papers mainly are written by 2 scholars or 3 from 2 sides, which means that they share main ideas on this topic. So it is, I think, a very good signal. So I will talk about the so-called cross-cutting horizontal issues a little bit. The first issue is about the negotiation function of the WTO, especially the open plurilateral agreements or negotiations. This is written by me and Professor Robert Wolff. Our basic idea is that the WTO is a forum, not an actor. And of course, we all know that the WTO is a member-driven organization, and especially right now, the 3 big members, EU, China, and the United States, are critical to create a consensus, at least at the beginning, at the early stage. But right now, following abolition of green room type deliberation, there are no bridge clubs that include all three major trade powers. We believe that this is a big problem. Now, of course, open plurilateral agreements have been accepted by many members, that it is a partial or at least positive solution to the consensus constraint. To reach critical mass, then the three major members are critical. For plurilateral negotiations, we think that there's still a legitimate issue here. Right now, there is no clear structure or clear framework or a path to launch and negotiate and reach a plurilateral agreement. And also, there's no mechanism to formal mechanism to incorporate these plurilaterals into the WTO. So our idea is that the main members, major members, especially China, EU, and the US, should launch an initiative to address this governance issue. So if members could reach or develop some governance principles for non-discriminatory plurilaterals, it will increase its transparency and also predictability, and to reduce the concerns of especially those non-participants. Having said that, we believe that open plurilaterals are possible and necessary, but still plurilaterals are not a panacea. There's still a need for cross-issue linkages or packages, deals. This is the first topic. The second one is about transparency, written by Professor Simon Evenett and Professor Kong Jingjiang. They found that notification performance is weak for many WTO members and also agreements. So this is not related to a few members. It's a very wide situation. So, like as of April 2021, 1/3 of the membership has yet to submit subsidy notifications for 2015. So this is a big problem, a wide problem. But the idea of the author is that folks must extend beyond inadequate compliance with notification obligations, because there are many measures which may have significant effects, but they are not required to be reported. They pay much attention to the subnational subsidies, which is a significant issue for China, but also for the United States. The authors believe that WTO members should establish a work program to improve domestic transparency of subsidies, to launch or initiate some wider or deeper discussions, domestic discussions on the impact or effectiveness of subsidies, which they believe that could increase the legitimacy and the effectiveness of subsidies. Then that would set a good basis for international discussions. Such information is necessary to improve notifications, as well as analysis of their incidence and spillover effects. The third issue is about dispute settlement. Was written by Professor Liao Shiping and Professor Petros Mavroidis. they believe that a central dimension of the value proposition of the WTO is depoliticized, independent third-party adjudication of trade disputes. They argue that the appellate body may not be so critical, indispensable, but they argue that this dispute settlement should be independent and depoliticized. They believe that this is the most important feature of the dispute settlement mechanism. And they believe that MPRA is a stopgap, but it cannot and not intended to be a long-term solution. So the WTO needed deliberations that build on Walker process and DSU review to ensure conflict resolution continues to be effective and depoliticized. So they always emphasize this point. Both China and the EU envisage this will continue to include an appeal mechanism, at least for now, but it's of course arguable. And I also believe that key need is to engage with the US to reestablish a conflict resolution function. Of course, we believe so. The problem is whether the US would like to respond. Clear signals on willingness to engage in negotiations on rules on substantive policies would increase incentives to resolve the dispute settlement crisis. Yeah, there's kind of trade-off here, but which should rank first? That's a problem. The fourth one is about economic development differentials among WTO members. It's written by Patrick Lowe. He believes that developing country status is distinct from special and differential treatment, which means that these two issues could be separated. Actually, this is a question I raised to him. And his very important argument is that there are actually two types of SDT. One is regulatory, another is market access. The former pertain to WTO rules, the latter determine terms of participation in a given market. Or actually, market access SDT is fully determined by each WTO member or each member to give this special treatment. It cannot be invoked by a beneficiary. So actually, it's not a gift. Or it's not a mandatory right. It's given by the other countries. And the most regulatory SDT is the best endeavors. Less than 1/4 involves flexibility that developing countries can invoke. So the actual significance or the actual preference is much less than we thought, probably. And the main message of him is the scope for opportunistic access to SDT by those developing countries considered undeserving is in fact limited. So to move forward, the WTO should launch a work program to establish how much the flexibility category of regulatory SDT is actually used. This will provide a basis for decisions by individual members to indicate they do not intend to do so in the future. I think this is very important for future negotiations. The last one is about non-trade objectives and the WTO rules, especially on like national security, climate change, and labor rights. A couple of professors are involved in this discussion. Now states have many concerns when trade does not align with political and non-trade areas. Many on the more non-trade issues have been brought into the WTO discussions. This actually creates a big challenge for the WTO, squaring domestic regulation of production processes such concerns with trade rules through provisions in WTO agreements. So these authors call for a deliberation that build on approaches used for product standards. Aim should be the main aim should be a more open process of multilateral evaluation of states' invocation to regulate and exceptions in WTO agreements, including on national security. So these issues should be more discussed by all members. And the same applies to use of trade measures in programs to combat climate change. So of course they are right in terms of values or security, but still because they have significant impact on trade. So we should launch more discussions on those issues. And the unilateral imposition of trade measures, for example, carbon border adjustment, risks violating WTO non-discrimination rules. So members should be careful about this. So I think I have taken too much time, so I'm going to stop here. Bernard, over to you.
Yep, thanks. Okay, so let me just say briefly something about the some of the substantive negotiating issues. So one, as I mentioned, there's a general sense it's important that as we move forward and think about moving forward, we need to address kind of old issues as well as new issues. And clearly there's a lot of focus on new, in quotes, think about digital trade, think about different types of subsidies. But actually one of the common themes that comes out of a lot of the chapters that deal with negotiating issues is subsidies, right? So subsidies of different types, whether they're direct fiscal grants, whether it works through state-owned enterprises, whether it's sector specific, and whether they deal with kind of good things or bad things, depending on where you stand. So good things would be to actually promote dealing with climate change. Those are all kind of things that are discussed in some length in many of the chapters. The key takeaway that I took from the agriculture, from the chapter on agriculture, is that the world really has changed. And a lot of what was negotiated in the WTO on agriculture reflects the state of play that we had in the 1970s, 1980s, where the European Union was the big kind of trade distorting player in terms of agricultural trade policies. That has changed. So now we have kind of differences in terms of both market shares, where emerging market economies play a much bigger role in global trade. And at the same time, we also have emerging economies play a much greater role in terms of actually implementing policies to assist agriculture in their markets. So one of the points that Lou and Matthews make in their chapter, which I think is really important, is a need to revisit some of the rules and the methodologies that are used to actually count what is regarded as trade distorting. And one of the things they raise here is the argument that has been made by India is that the way domestic support is actually calculated makes no sense, because in a sense, what happens quite frequently is that countries can get punished for providing support to farmers, which is actually below world market prices, right? And the WTO, what we have in the agreement on agriculture does not pick that up. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting factual and technical discussion in that paper, and I really recommend that paper on agriculture. Subsidies, as I mentioned, is a common theme of many of the negotiating issues that are addressed in the book. If you look at the Global Trade Alert, which tracks what governments are doing, more than half of all measures that have been imposed since the global financial crisis are subsidies. Of course, now, as we live through and try to recover from COVID-19, the share of subsidies in total government measures has been increasing quite rapidly. There is nothing necessarily bad about this. This is what governments are there to do, but nonetheless, it can create competitive distortion. So what is argued in the chapter by Lee and Rubini is we need to do a much better job on the transparency front, and we need to do a much better job in the WTO in actually figuring out what subsidies are potentially of concern in terms of competitive spillovers, and what subsidies are not. And as you all know, in terms of WTO rules, they don't really pay a lot of attention as to what the objective is of a subsidy. The focus is very much on either prohibiting some subsidies outright, and everything else is actionable. A similar type of message emerges from the chapter on state-owned enterprises, where the argument that is made by myself and André Sapir is that there's actually quite a lot that has happened in regional trade agreements. Think about the CPTPP, RCEP, but also the Common Agreement on Investment, which was negotiated between the EU and China, where we actually have quite innovative approaches in terms of dealing with the potential competitive spillovers of what state-owned enterprises do. And one of the things that is argued in the paper, but also in another paper by that deals with investment, is that the EU and China have actually gone quite far in terms of defining what would make sense for them to do, what they're comfortable with jointly, in terms of increasing both transparency and increasing disciplines in these types of areas. So what we argue in the chapter is that there's a real need to both build on that progress that has been made. Now, of course, the Common Agreement on Investment is dead in the water for political reasons. But there's a lot of substance in that agreement that arguably could be pulled into a WTO type of discussion, right? Where you could build on that. And that's not just the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. The same applies to some of the agreements that have been negotiated in the Asia Pacific. A final remark on digital trade and investment and services, which are three other topics that are addressed in different chapters. Here are what I would say is essentially that a common theme of these chapters is one, partly this is an old agenda, which has become more important. So there's a danger of services not getting the attention they should be getting. Clearly, we now have the e-commerce discussion. We have the discussion on domestic regulation of services. But again, there's a lot that has been done on the services front in regional trade agreements, which we don't really see being reflected in the WTO. And a common theme of all three chapters is that these are all examples where in principle plurilateral cooperation should be possible and should be pursued. And of course, China needs to be part of that discussion. And I think China, having signaled that it is interested in joining the CPTPP, kind of illustrates that as far as China is concerned, the government feels ready to actually engage in that type of a discussion. And I think one of the things that is of interest in terms of looking forward is to what extent that interest in doing things regionally within trade agreements could be transferred to the WTO. And I think that's really a question that I would have to Chinese officials saying, so if you're interested in joining CPTPP, why don't we do some of those things also in a WTO context? So just to conclude, 4 priorities really on the institutional front that are highlighted in the various chapters. One is to actually deal and confront the fact that there really isn't a robust enabling environment at the moment for plurilateral cooperation in the WTO, especially for issues that you can't say is really an extension of an existing agreement. So the WTO makes provision for plurilateral agreements that are discriminatory or that might be discriminatory along the lines of the government procurement agreement, but there really isn't a docking station for agreements that are actually open, non-discriminatory, and only apply to countries that are willing to join them. Again, as was already mentioned, if we don't deal with the dispute settlement crisis, then we're not going to make a lot of progress in negotiations because then it will be much more difficult to enforce. And the MPIA approach, which has been put in place by the European Union and which China is part of, is not going to be enough to actually incentivize countries to make, to engage in negotiations. Transparency, a common theme of many of the chapters. Yes, progress has been made, but if you compare what the Global Trade Alert does, for example, to what the WTO does, there's really quite a lot that can and should be improved in terms of enhancing transparency of trade-related policies, in particular for subsidies and state-owned enterprises. And finally, a priority on the institutional kind of fix the machine front is to confront and address this issue of economic development and special and differential treatment. And here, I would really strongly encourage anyone who is interested in this topic to read Patrick Lowe's chapter, because I think it is the best explanation of what the issues really are. And it does a hugely important job at pricking through balloons in terms of arguments that are often made that simply don't hold any water. So there's a lot of allegations made about countries invoking special and differential treatment that in practice simply don't apply. There's a lot of opportunity for China and the EU to work with other countries to support work programs in these different areas. And again, here, as I already mentioned, I think China's request to join the CPTPP, the fact that the RCEP was negotiated including China, the fact that the comprehensive agreement on investment was actually concluded in terms of negotiations, that all suggests there's really a lot to build on. And I think one of the big questions I would have, and I think one of the big kind of challenges in terms of enhancing the relevance of the WTO looking forward is, will the EU and China work together to actually do more of this in a WTO plurilateral setting? And I think that's really an open question. I'm sure we can have a debate on this, but ultimately, you know, to use the opportunities that the WTO has and offers to members to actually do this depends on those members actually doing it, right? And I think here the stylized fact is we've seen too little engagement by the major players, i.e. in this case, the EU and China, to actually work together to bring on board other countries. So yes, we've seen the Ottawa Group, we've seen an initiative on public health. We would argue we need to see much more of that on policy areas that actually create serious competitive spillovers. So that's where I end this slide with the key question: do members actually want to use the WTO to help manage geopolitical rivalry and policy spillovers? So again, let me stop there. It's on the Vox EU website. It's free. You can download it. I would also very quickly also encourage people who are interested in WTO reform questions to have a look at a special issue of the journal Global Policy, which also includes a range of articles which deal more with the working practices of the WTO, and which are another spin-off of the bigger project that I mentioned that actually has supported all of this work. Thanks. Let me end there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you, and actually to all of the authors of the piece for putting together such a really, I think, a provocative and interesting set of articles. And again, I'm not just saying that because I happen to be on this panel. It's genuinely true. I think it's quite interesting, and I think the very short snapshot that you got gives you a sense of the scope and the range of topics that were considered in this piece. Please do put questions into the chat if you have any. So let me just talk through a few things that I think are particularly useful about what has been raised in this book. First, I would say, yes, it's a bunch of academics. I mean, that's how people would describe themselves, I suppose. A bunch of academics and sort of researchers, think tanks, et cetera, in thinking about the issues related to trade, global trade, WTO reform, et cetera. But what I found particularly striking about this is that the suggestions that are included are practical. Now, that doesn't always happen when you get a bunch of academics to sit together and think about stuff. They tend to come up with sort of, best case scenario, ideal positions that have no basis in reality and will never see the light of day. What I particularly liked about this is that it's very practical, it's very grounded. It comes from people who have a long history with the WTO generally, and so they really understand the institution, what it does, what it doesn't do, what it can do, what it can never do. And so I think that is missing in a lot of the discussion, which tends to be either at the 30,000 foot level or at the sort of idealism. Yes, it should be like this. And I think what was useful about this is that this concrete, practical steps that I think make a lot of sense, including one theme that I can't emphasize enough comes up over and over again. Perhaps this is the academic speaking, but I think it's relevant, is the need for data. So we have a lot of conversations going on, including across the WTO public forum, about different issues, ranging from everything from the structure of the institution to very specific issues related to this. And in most of those discussions, like you saw in the agriculture slide that you saw here with the subsidy figures, the information may be completely out of date. So I think the agriculture chapter highlights that point. I think Patrick Lowe's chapter on special and differential treatment also makes this abundantly clear, that sometimes we're having a debate about something that's not even a problem. And sometimes we are ignoring things that actually are a problem, but we just don't have enough information, or we're looking at the wrong information. So I think the need for data comes through repeatedly. And if we could get better transparency and better data, we actually might end up with a better, at least a sense of what the challenges are and what the challenges are not. And we would then spend time on those things that are particularly relevant, and we could potentially spend less time on things that are less relevant. I mean, I know that sounds straightforward, but actually, when you look at the WTO in general and many of the debates around it, you realize how much intellectual capital has been spent on some of the areas that actually may not be that meaningful, while we ignore a lot of very new topics, many of which are covered in this book. So I think that that's particularly useful. I think when it comes to structural suggestions, what I liked about the chapter at the beginning on open plurilateralism is again, concrete and practical suggestions about how do you ensure that such plurilaterals are in fact acceptable to everyone. So what is the actual framework that you need to have in place to continue along the plurilateral path? I think that's useful, to remind people that there needs to be a process in place. And also the reminder that plurilaterals on their own cannot solve everything, because you still have some intractable problems that probably need to be linked somehow in order to solve things. You may not need the single undertaking package approach, but there needs to be some way for, I would argue, especially for officials and leaders to come back to their domestic constituents and say, okay, yeah, you're right. I didn't get as much as I wanted in part A, but in part B, C, and D, look what we did receive. And without that, it's very difficult to sell what appears to be a losing proposition to a domestic audience. And so I think that is a useful reminder as we all sort of stampede towards plurilaterals as the solution. Transparency and notification, crucial. And I think, again, the data suggests, and the data that's even referenced in the chapters suggest, we are falling woefully short of transparency and notification in so many ways. Now, part of that may come back to a sort of larger theme that Bernard raised at the end, which is, what is the appetite for doing more? We've had transparency and notification procedures and requirements in place for a very long time. But if nobody's being transparent and nobody's notifying, maybe they're not doing it on purpose. Maybe they don't want to be transparent and aren't just interested in notifying. And so we can have all the brilliant suggestions we want about how you might accomplish that goal, how you might incentivize members, et cetera. But at the end of the day, if a member doesn't want to be transparent and they're not interested in notifying, then what? So I think that is a challenge that we face. Highly recommend that chapter by Patrick on special differential treatment. It's really interesting, especially because when you start looking at the data and you start sort of unpacking some of these arguments, and that chapter does it especially well, you realize that maybe this is less of an issue than many people argue, or that potentially the issue is someplace else. So it's not that there's no issues, it's that the issues that are being discussed are not actually the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is in an adjacent space. I think that that's particularly useful. And then I would also say that there, in the section of the book, the half of the book on negotiation topics, what I found particularly striking, again, which we see, but we often have this sort of disconnect between what the WTO does and what everybody else does outside of the WTO. But the outside of the WTO is increasingly the trade space. So if we're not going to reference what we're doing in other venues like CPTPP, RCEP, and elsewhere, then we're going to miss opportunities to actually address the global issues. So I think that that's nice to bring that back in there, including issues on subsidies, which is clearly going to, let me rephrase that, it ought to be a key driving factor of the WTO agenda. Will it be is, I think, an open question, but at least it ought to be. And state-owned enterprises, which might seem striking for people, like that's not on the WTO radar. Why would we add that? But that is an issue. There are trade distorting effects that can come from SOEs. And if we don't want to address that, then again, we're sort of missing an opportunity to deal with real problems that matter for the global trading system. And so I think adding in issues on services, investment, digital, some of which is under the WTO and has been discussed for a while, but in new ways perhaps, or new areas altogether, like SOEs, I think is particularly relevant. And the last point that I would just make at the end, just to sort of echo what Bernard said, is, what is the appetite for doing so? So this is a really interesting book that I think puts forth a potential. I mean, you could collapse it into a really interesting negotiating agenda and a point of discussion and so forth. But at the end of the day, if the members are not interested, then what are you going to do about it? And so I had a fascinating high-level discussion earlier this week in which I was not particularly popular, because I suggested that maybe we have the WTO that we do because the members want to have the WTO that we do. So as academics or outsiders or businesses or, even people who are engaged in the WTO, we may say, why isn't it doing X or Y? Or isn't there huge scope for opportunities for collaboration on, B, C, and D, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, if the members themselves are actually not interested in resolving some of these issues, then you can't resolve these issues. And I don't know how long we have to keep going with a discussion about a reform agenda before we actually either decide to engage on that reform agenda or we say this is not going to happen. And so I think that this is another piece, this particular book is another piece that is, in my view, a clarion call for changes, for reform, but in practice, grounded ways. So it's not a hypothetical kind of set of solutions. But if there's no appetite for doing that, then where are you? And I come back at the end to the transparency and notification requirements. If you cannot notify and you're not interested in being transparent, then we can have all the discussions we want to have, but you're not going to change this fundamental problem. And so I think that is a major crisis that the WTO needs to be grappling with. And I'm delighted that we're on this panel to be able to help discuss that, and other panels across the public forum and elsewhere, I think flagging sort of similar issues. But at some point, I think we need to be a bit bold and say, what are we doing? If we're not interested in really engaging in a reform agenda, then all the good suggestions that you come up with for making one is not going to make it so. So let me stop there. Hopefully, again, you're putting in questions into the chat function. And then I'm in a sort of dual role here as moderator and commentator. So let me turn it over to the ambassador for her remarks. And then again, Q&A follows after that. So please do put in those comments. So Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, professors, and also thank the moderator, Deborah. May I call you Deborah? Thanks for the invitation. I must say that today I'm making some of the remarks or comments on my own responsibility, not as ambassador of Thailand, but rather as a person who has been engaged in WTO and on trade matters for a long time. So sometimes I speak very bluntly, which is not good for being ambassador, I suppose, but I think this is one of the opportunity that I can do so. Also, even though this is my second time in Geneva, for this round as ambassador, I've just been here for about 6 months. So I still trying to get involved with several processes. That's just a little bit shortcomings that I have to say it in upfront. So as Deborah have said earlier, I also found this book very, very interesting, and very thought-provoking, even for me who have been back in Geneva second time. And moreover, I think the book is very readable. Sometimes you feel like it's like a storytelling in some chapters. And I must say that it is very up to date. So they have touched on issues that are being discussed right now in the MC12, and also some of the chapters I felt like the authors were in the negotiating room with other ambassadors. So I think the book is very useful. I have seen that the participants or listeners today are mainly from the EU, many different European participants, but also from Asia, particularly from China and Korea. But I must say that this book is not only for China and the EU. If you have time to read it, you will find that the issues that the authors have touched upon or selected are applicable to everybody who are interested on trade matters and to see how things are moving. I think in the beginning I was quite ambivalent that really do the EU and China, do they actually have a common interest on trade matters at the WTO? Because over here I have not I have not heard much that they are speaking in a convergent manner. Sometimes they are in tandem, but not converging. But when I finish reading the books, and I really see that, yes, the EU and China do really share their interest in seeing the rule making of the multilateral system ongoing. They are both active players at the WTO, and also they are some of the issues are more forward looking, which I also believe that China and the EU both have interest, particularly like things like digital or climate change. So I think that the book is very up to date and modern, and it will be useful for the future. I have a few points that I want to touch on the chapters, but also have some suggestions on what could be improved or added in the future. I think I find the division of systemic issues and horizontal issues separately from the substantive issues have made the analysis very clear and very poignant in my view. So I commend you on that. They have raised the questions also on what exactly should be constituted as WTO reform. You know, WTO reform, taking from my colleagues, other ambassadors, can be either revise of the existing rules and see whether it's good or not good. If it's not good, not relevant, or too outdated, then we should revise and review it. But also there are reform on the new things, on bringing in new issues, structural reform or decision making. So I think at this point should be made clearer too. But the chapter has touched on that, but not so clear. I also found the chapters on negotiation process very illuminating, you know. But I myself, I'm not so sure that the suggestion is can be done soon. But it is like Deborah said, a very practical suggestion. I would not. I would just go quickly on. Okay, some of the issue I would not touch on, like plurilateral, because we don't have time. I want to highlight on subsidies, you know, because in the presentation, Professor Bernard have not touched upon it much, and Professor too as well. What I found interesting a lot is that wow, subsidy is now an important trade measures in the world. A lot of countries, even before COVID time, has been using a lot of subsidies measures. But because some of them are not supposed to be there, you know, like we should have no more industrial subsidies, like the subsidies agreement doesn't allow industrial subsidies. But yes, everybody is doing it. And in the WTO, we have discussed about subsidies in agriculture, in fishery, and in some other matters. Outside the WTO, questions on subsidies are being discussed relating to China's policy to support technology company, to support startup. And it has been a source of several conflicts, maybe outside the WTO as well as inside. So this is one area that I want to highlight, that the book has really been successful in providing the importance of subsidies and how they are linked together. And I feel that this should be one area where WTO members should discuss in the future. I'm saying should, I'm not so sure that they would, because like I said, this has become the most popular trade measures that is occurring in the world today. But the book really nicely tied together subsidies in all the areas. I also will skip the agriculture, because, although it's very good, digital climate change and services and state enterprise. I think S&D, again, I have comments on this. Like all the speakers have said, I found the chapter very illuminating. And also the suggestion, you know, the separation of market access, S&D and regulatory S&D are very helpful in in my thoughts, at least. I hope other readers will find it too, that this is the same thing. Market access, for me personally, I'm speaking personally, regulatory S&D should not be allowed too much. You know, everybody should play or strive to play on the same rules. That's my view. But of course, you should allow some kind of grace period or some time for adjustment. But in the end, everybody should be operating on the same rules. For market access or the tariff reduction or liberalization commitment, I think that may be a little bit more, should be commensurate to level of development. So I think the distinction between regulatory S&D and market access are very useful. And they, when we discuss about this issue in the WTO, we should be mindful about that. I think I have to skip some other points. I just want to go straight to my suggestion, you know, given the time. I have about 3 or 4 points that maybe you can help in the future. I think what the book is missing out a lot, in my view, is that the role of other non-superpowers. You know, the book has posited that WTO will survive if the 3 major superpowers, you know, China, EU, and US, can get together and agree on something. But of course, here in Geneva, things are different. You know, we have seen many developing countries like India or South Africa or some others. They are playing important role too. Maybe they have more political interest in the back of their minds. I cannot say for sure. I'm you know, I'm not in the position to say that. But I think the book could benefit from like additional chapters of views on how you can get together all those non-superpowers into what you are discussing here. I think there's a big chunk missing on here. So we have read about EU, US, China's view, how you can engage, but other players are important too. So if there can be some chapters on others, then it will make it more complete. Second issue that I would like to suggest is that, of course, I heard that Professor Hoekman said that trade and health will not be here. But having been in Geneva for almost 6 months now, I can tell you that this issue will remain an important area in the WTO in the future. So maybe there's no time to add a chapter now on trade and health, but I think the politics in Geneva about waiver, CL, vaccine, and trade and health now is going to shape up the relations between the members here. I think it will be one of the deal maker or deal breaker in the MC12. So if you have time in the future, maybe you can also do some follow-up. That is an outcome of the MC12. And also, I think trade and health will be an area in the future that everybody interested in trade should add to. Another area that I think can be a good candidate is supply chain reconfiguration as a fallout from the trade war between US and China. I'm sorry, Deborah, I have to say this. I'm from Thailand. We were affected a lot by the trade war. So the question for us, like in Asia, that the fallout, okay, it's not only about tariff, but it has a lot of impact on investment and on value chain in Asia and in many other countries. I think to answer questions on geopolitical that Professor asked at the end, I think we should explore the supply chain too in the future. Last but not least, I think the role of Secretariat and the DG. This is tied back to Deborah's comments on transparency and also on Professor. I fully share your views that we can not move ahead if we don't have enough good, sufficient analysis. And so for me, one of the things that I'm very disappointed coming back here in Geneva and the second time is that I don't see the contribution from Secretariat in terms of analysis at all. I have heard that this is due to some political backroom at the WTO, But I don't want to negotiate in ignorance. You know, I think the Secretariat, with the support of DG and other, have to come up with a credible and a good analysis of the important issues that we are being discussed here. So, so those are my comments for now. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. I think those were all fantastic points. I wish that we had a lot more time to discuss this, but we have a hard stop and they will cut us off. So we have 2 minutes for Professor Tu and for Bernard to respond. And then I think we're going to end the session. So I don't know which one of the two of you wants to go first, but 2 minutes. And then they're going to chop us off.
Okay, so just to clarify, I have been looking at this monitoring platform and Q&A. I don't see anything, but that might be completely my fault. So apologies to anybody who actually has been trying to ask questions. Xin-Chuan, you want to go first?
No, you go first, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, let me just take up a couple of the points that were raised. So one is where are the middle powers? You know, where are the other countries? And I think that's a really important observation. And clearly it's something that we are not ignorant of the fact that there are many countries that are, of course, members of the WTO. I think the premise of many of the chapters was we're not going to get anywhere if the big three are not on the same page, or at least trying to achieve something in a particular direction. And that's simply, unfortunately, a fact of life. But I would also emphasize that a lot of the issues that are being discussed in the book are issues that are really important for smaller countries, for middle-income countries, for developing countries. And I think it is incumbent upon them to actually engage with the big players as well. Now, of course, India, South Africa are large countries. They're very active. I would argue we need to see much more engagement by smaller countries who actually are pushing their interests. Right? I think that's an important part of the equation, which I would argue has somewhat been missing. And it goes back to what Deborah was saying in the beginning, that a necessary condition for doing that is to actually focus on big issues, right? Issues that really matter for development, for example, as opposed to stuff that, okay, it would be nice to have, it hits particular bells, but it's not really going to move the needle in terms of economic growth, poverty reduction, what have you. And I think that's where, again, where the focus should be, and where I would argue we don't see enough focus. On the trade and health point you mentioned, that it should be there, I agree that this is something that should be there. And in parallel work, we've certainly been working on this, but I think where the trade and health initiatives become important in terms of thinking about where the WTO should go, is it really is a mechanism to take the supply chain seriously, right? Because we're not going to get a big increase in production of vaccines without trade, right? We need a lot of trade in inputs, we need a lot of trade in outputs. We need to have more robust, resilient, diversified supply chains, great. But I think I think it's really brought home, I hope, to everybody how important that structure of production actually is, and how important it is to make and support firms to actually use it, right? So I think if it becomes a vehicle to actually start thinking about where are there weaknesses in supply chains, where are there things that government should do to help firms operate more efficiently, that is all to the good. And I think it's a way of bringing the private sector more into WTO deliberations, including committees, right, which has also been missing. So the Global Policy Journal special issue that I mentioned at the end of my presentation actually has a lot of very specific suggestions in terms of how you might go about doing that. Some of that is being discussed right now, right? It is very much now on the table in the WTO in a way it wasn't before. But again, it goes back to this basic issue of information, data, and analysis, right? And governments, one of my takeaways from the global financial, from the pandemic was governments really didn't know how vaccines were being produced, where personal protective equipment came from, and what they could do to actually boost supply. Let me stop there and give it to Xin-Chuan.
Okay, thank you. I think the time is almost up, but
sorry about that.
Just no, it's fine. I just think that such kind of academic cooperation is also very helpful very beneficial for the development of the WTO. As I said, this is our new try, but I think we may have more such kind of tries to find at least find more common thoughts on this issue, and we can convey this kind of ideas or information to the governments. So then I think we academia could play some positive role in this sense. So I hope look forward to more cooperation with Bernard and also thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to have to wrap it up now, but I want to thank everyone for participating in what I found a very useful conversation. I hope that you did too. Please do take a look at this book because I do think it's a useful guide. And if it were implemented, I can only imagine like what sorts of things would come from it. So let's fingers crossed that we actually get some implementation of some of the suggestions that are included in that book. And I want to thank everyone for participating on this panel today. And maybe we'll see you at the next WTO Public Forum. So thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.